Welcome to HBTV. I'm HB, Harry Binswanger. I'm a philosopher who advocates Ayn Rand's philosophy of objectivism. Today, in this episode, we're going to take up the conflict between Ayn Rand's views and Friedrich Hayek's views. Now, I have to begin by noting that although I'm going to, as one who advocates Ayn Rand's position, be very hard on Hayek, because I think he's really wrong. He's really wrong in his philosophy, not in his very narrowly conceived economics. His economics, from what I understand, is an improvement or development of the Austrian school's theory of pricing as carrying information, along with other ideas that Hayek developed. But that's the one that's been my attention, that he is a better expositor, or maybe it's not better, he further develops the Austrian line of thinking on the fact that prices in a free market carry information to both consumers and producers. So I don't mean to be criticizing him on that. I think he's an ally. He and Ayn Rand both advocate capitalism, although he has a compromised version of capitalism, as we'll see. Not pure laissez-faire capitalism, which he explicitly disavows and calls for some government intervention. But by and large, if we restrict ourselves to his economic theories about how the free market mechanism works, he represents an advance. The other thing I want to say in his defense is that he came to the aid of my late colleague and friend, John Ridpath, when John was being thrown out of his university by being denied tenure. York University in Ontario, Canada, had denied him tenure. So he and I together went to an economics conference at the University of Connecticut, at which Hayek was present, to ask for him to write a letter in defense of John's scholarly ability. John had met Hayek before, when John was at the University of Chicago doing research. He didn't have a position at the University of Chicago, but he had access to the libraries. And on that occasion, John, being a very gregarious fellow, did meet Hayek along with other luminaries there at the University of Chicago. Hayek, sitting outside, I didn't get to meet Hayek, but John approached him and met him and explained what the situation was. And Hayek was sitting outside on a patio in between events in the conference. And he took out a piece of paper. He asked John a few questions, and he wrote, handwritten, a letter of recommendation to the York University committee on behalf of John. Now, Hayek had just won the Nobel Prize in economics. So John was appealing his case. He had been denied tenure, but it was appealable. And this was part of the appeal. And it's very hard to say this fellow is not going to produce any good work when a Nobel Prize winner has handwritten a letter saying he will. And John's career was saved. He was able to continue at York. They reversed the decision. And the decision was made strictly on ideological grounds. That's another story for another time, but it was the Marxists in the department who wanted John out, since John was an objectivist and therefore a laissez-faire capitalist. So I'm grateful as a friend of John's and as a supporter of capitalism that Hayek did that. And I think that he does represent an advance in economics. But now we turn to the bad part. Shortly before her death, I asked Ayn Rand about her view of Hayek. But there was a background to this, and it's rather amazing. I knew an economist, a pro-capitalist economist who was an objectivist, and his wife, who was very intellectually active also, had noticed that Ayn Rand had pushed Mises, had recommended Mises, reviewed Mises's books in her publications, and had a positive attitude towards Mises, even though Mises has very many flaws philosophically. But she didn't have any recommendation of Hayek, and she just stayed publicly away from Hayek altogether. And the wife of the economist said to me, I could understand if her objections were intellectual, but they're not. I don't understand why Ayn Rand isn't more pro-Hayek. So I used to see Ayn Rand quite frequently at that period close to her death, the late 70s. So I asked her, what's your objection to Hayek? And as if she had ESP, she said, it's intellectual. So my friend's wife had said, I could understand if it's intellectual, but it isn't. And Ayn Rand somehow, the very word, it's intellectual, was what she began with. Now, her objections to Hayek and the intensity of them are a matter of record, because there is a very interesting book that I'm holding up now for those who are watching me on video, Ayn Rand's Marginalia, her marginal comments that she wrote in her own copies of books. It's by Robert Mayhew, a professor of philosophy at Seton Hall University. It's a very interesting book, and she has extended comments on The Road to Serfdom, which you remember is the book that catapulted Hayek to fame in pro-capitalist circles. I also, as I said, talked with her a bit. I don't remember her specific complaints about Hayek because I was so stunned that she chose to say it's intellectual after that had been denied by my friend's wife. But it's pretty obvious, both from her what the objections are, her marginal comments, which I'm going to quote you some of, and from what Hayek says. Ayn Rand's view was that statism, meaning all forms of concentrating power in the government at the expense of individual freedom, whether it's communist, fascist, monarchist, or any form of tyranny whatsoever, that statism comes from altruism. That is, from the ethics that Christianity spread, the ethics of self-sacrifice. Hayek is not willing to go there. Hayek fears morality. He believes that morality cannot be discussed in rational terms. His book, The Fatal Conceit, which we'll go into a little bit, has as a frontispiece quote this statement from David Hume. He has two other quotes also, but the middle one is this by David Hume. The rules of morality are not the conclusions of our reason. This is the famous is-ought dichotomy that Hume is the father of, although it's generally held in the history of philosophy, that you cannot prove a code of ethics that's beyond the province of reason. Hayek says that, I think, because he's afraid. That's psychologizing. I don't really know what his motive is, but I know the way he writes and the twists and turns he makes to avoid damning or disagreeing with the predominant morality. Now, why do I side with Ayn Rand that the cause of the decline of capitalism is the ethical code of sacrifice? Well, just today in the Wall Street Journal, I pick up the Wall Street Journal, and again, for those of you who have video, there's this little ad. It shows an adorable little girl, maybe 5 years old. She's smiling, and the text is, everyone deserves a decent place to live. Learn more at habitat.org, Habitat for Humanity. Now, that's what defeats capitalism. It's the appeal to sacrifice for the needy, supporting the most vulnerable among us. You know, that phrase that is so popular. That's what animates anti-capitalists. And Ayn Rand would say in regard to this, everyone deserves a decent place to live. At whose expense? A decent place to live has to be provided by someone. If it's not provided by the person who's living there, then it has to be provided either voluntarily through charity or by force, government collection of taxation, by someone else. So what this says, everyone deserves a decent place to live, means some people have to labor for others without compensation. It's a call for slavery, involuntary servitude. And this adorable little girl who tugs at your heartstrings is the window dressing. But what it actually means is all shall sacrifice for all. Give up, renounce, turn over your assets to the state. We'll have a wealth tax, not just an income tax. I mean, it's right on the cutting edge of every appeal by, in America, the Democratic Party, and in the UK, well, I shouldn't say it, in America by the Democratic and Republican parties, because both sides accept altruism. And in the UK by the Tories and the socialists and everyone in between. There's no party that says, no, everyone does not deserve a decent place to live. Does Hitler deserve a decent place to live? Now, this little girl obviously is not Hitler. She's adorable, as I said. But first of all, it absolutely destroys the concepts of deserve. Everybody deserves what they earn, what they develop the qualities in them to merit. It is not true that everyone deserves a decent place to live. But even if there's someone who deserves a decent, who has earned the equivalent of it, let's take this case. A minority member in a prejudiced area earns the money to rent an apartment, but no one will rent it to him. There's a sense in which he deserves an apartment. He's there, he's willing to pay for it. There's no rational reason why any of the landlords who are renting apartments to others should turn him down. It's bigotry and prejudice. So that person, you could say, does deserve and is not getting a decent place to live due to the irrationality and collectivism, because racism is a form of collectivism, of the people around him. But the solution to that is not government action to make people do with their apartments or whatever what they do not choose to do. But basically, what I'm saying, I'm kind of straying from my main line here. My main line here is you've got to be able to challenge the appeal to self-sacrifice. Why do you have so much when others have little? I was just, let's see if I can pull this quote up quickly. I was searching almost at random from a quote, for a quote from Ayn Rand, and I came upon this. When the thugs of Europe's people's states, that's what they were called in Atlas Shrugged, the socialist states, when the thugs of Europe's people's states snarl that you are guilty of intolerance because you don't treat your desire to live and their desire to kill you as a difference of opinion, you cringe and hasten to assure them that you are not intolerant of any horror, that you're not intolerant of any horror. When some barefoot bum in some pest hole of Asia yells at you, "How dare you be rich?" you apologize and beg him to be patient and promise him you'll give it all away. You have reached the blind alley of the treason you committed when you agreed that you had no right to exist. And that's the kind of standing up to the power base of the left that's required if the left is ever to be defeated and freedom is ever to be restored. But that's not what Hayek is all about. What Hayek is all about is appeasing. Just like this, no, I'm not intolerant of your desire to kill me. No, I'm not saying that we can't have government help the most vulnerable against us. I'm just saying, because what does Hayek say against it? You're making a factual mistake. You're making a factual mistake. The interventions that you are advocating won't work. They'll lead to consequences that are different from what you think, unintended consequences. It's a matter of just a factual error. Quote from Was Socialism a Mistake in The Fatal Conceit? Is the last work that he was planning, but was completed by some of his students. But he wrote this: the socialist aims and programs are factually impossible to achieve or execute. And they also happen into the bargain, as it were, to be logically impossible. This is why, contrary to what is often maintained, these matters are not merely ones of differing interests or value judgments. Indeed, the question of how men came to adopt certain values or norms and what effect these had on the evolution of their civilization is itself, above all, a factual one. The demands of socialism, this is like the cashing in, the demands of socialism are not moral conclusions. Now he goes on to say, this, which I would, to direct what he's just said, not moral conclusions derived from the traditions that formed the extended order that made civilizations possible. They overthrow traditions. So this is his argument for capitalism. His argument why you shouldn't be killed or sent to a concentration camp to be tortured before you die is, well, that doesn't fit the traditions. Now you might think I'm parodying it. He doesn't state it that bluntly, but that's what it comes to. There's no reason why you're being tortured to death is actually wrong. But here's what we can say against it. There's a cultural evolution in addition to the biological evolution. And there's a grain of truth in that, an element of truth, more than a grain, but not the way he applies it. Over time, societies evolve, groups evolve into societies, and there's a kind of natural selection. He says, the social arrangements that lead to wealth and harmony and the ability to fund military power even displace the traditions that do not advance those very traditions because they have bad consequences. So if you have a tradition that half of the harvest has to be thrown into the river to placate the river god, your tribe is going to be hungrier than the neighboring tribe, which has no such tradition. If the neighboring tribe has a tradition that the farmer who, I guess they went out, the hunter probably at this point, the hunter who kills the most and brings back the most meat is lauded and celebrated and allowed to have an extra portion of that meat, that society is moving in the right direction. Its traditions will be self-sustaining, self-reproducing. And that's kind of like evolution, where the most fit survive, right? So the traditions that win out and come to be lasting traditions, Hayek argues, are the ones that favor a progressive society. And that's how we come to the United States of America, except for one telling detail. It's historically absolutely false. Has he never heard of the fall of Rome, of the Dark Ages, the Middle Ages, and then the Renaissance? Believing that reason cannot enter the value realm, he holds that it can't be anyone's understanding of what the right way to live is that accounts for what societies do. It has to be blind. This is his idea that's at the core of his philosophy, not his economics, of spontaneous order. That's a phrase that's repeated by Hayek and Hayekians all the time, spontaneous order. Spontaneous order is their answer to, how can I stop the left without opposing the morality of Christianity, of self-sacrifice, of the meek shall inherit the earth, the rich won't get into heaven. So how can I fight that? Well, you know, the traditions of Western civilization, and he only looks back as far as, 1600, really. By implication, I don't know what he actually looked back at. These are moving in the direction, until recently, of greater individual freedom. So these have been selected because they work. They're selected for their success in the societies where they're used. So let's not throw those away. So here's this little girl. If you don't vote Democratic and if you don't recycle, this little girl will die. And the answer to that is, well, there's a lot of wisdom embodied in what happened to spontaneously evolve about social arrangements. Let's not rock the boat. And that's what the fatal conceit is. The title is The Fatal Conceit, The Errors of Socialism. The fatal conceit is the idea that we can choose political economic arrangements, that someone can use his mind to figure out what the right social arrangements are. And he's very aware that, I don't know how consciously aware he is, but he must be sensing at least that if you say it's done on the basis of morality, the game is over for freedom. Because morality to him means everyone deserves a decent place to live, an education, medical care, high-speed internet, whatever it is, everyone deserves. And those damn billionaires who have too much money, they don't deserve that. Why do they have money when some people are hungry? I mean, extra money, all that money. So he has no way to answer that. Now, he's not alone in that. I mean, other than Ayn Rand, who does have a way to answer that? But his pseudo answer is, let's not tamper with the evolved traditions. Well, what about the evolved traditions of Islam? You know, Islam spread by military means. They would conquer a country, and at the end they would say, if you convert to Islam and pay 10% to the government, to our military, we won't kill you. And so that funded the taking over of the next country. This is well known. This is not my theory. It's the practice that you can read about. That's where I heard about it, on the internet. And you know, you can't put it on the internet if it isn't true. So some traditions are vicious and they can spread for a long time. So you cannot appeal to tradition to avoid answering the charge, how dare you be rich when others are poor? You have to say, why not? I earned it. Others are poor because their governments hold them down, or because in some cases they're just no good as people. You know, you go to someone even in our country who's out on the sidewalk, strung out on heroin, and you then look at Thomas Edison would be, you know, or any person who earns his own way. And he's, how dare you have stuff when this guy doesn't? No, the guy is a louse. He's a bum. We used to call them a bum. Now we call them the homeless or the underclass. And there's no concept of earning whatsoever. And Hayek is not appealing to earning. He's saying no individual mind and no group collaboration of minds is smart enough to replace the market. And that kind of morphs over to is smart enough to design social conditions, is smart enough to say what ought to be the case politically. Nobody knows that. We've got to be humble and stop pretending, A, that we know what the good is, and B, that we can plan the economy. So the naive understanding of Hayek, and to be fair to him, I think his main target was government bureaucrats planning the economy. You know, like how the COVID response went. Everything was done by the government. That's an exaggeration. The Operation Warp Speed selected certain companies to be funded. Now, Pfizer didn't take any of that money. And they didn't take it because they didn't want to be under the government's thumb. But there was money given to 5 companies, including, unfortunately, Moderna, by the government. And every aspect of it, in the early stages at least, of the development of and the distribution of the vaccine, was run by the government. And everybody thinks the government has to do everything. They approve or disapprove what you take. And if they approve it, they give it to you. They give it to you for free, which means that paid out of tax money. So today it is accepted that the government is going to do, going to plan medicine, socialized medicine, and all the fascist-sized medicine that is outside of government direct ownership. Collectivized medicine is on the premise of government planning. Government knows best. The FDA knows, the CDC knows, your doctor doesn't know. You don't know. That's the target that Hayek is after. But it's not on this specific thing about what drugs work and what don't work, but that it's conceit to think you know what ought to be done in society. You got to be humble. You got to realize that what has evolved works. Don't go tampering with it. Don't imagine you can think your way to a solution. Now, notice what this puts together into one package. An individual thinking and persuading others of his thought or her thought, because I have in mind Ayn Rand, working to tell other people the right social relations are those in which no man initiates the use of physical force against others. So Hayek would proscribe her doing that. He would call that conceit. You can't know that. There's no science of morals. There's no reason applied to morality. You can't know that. You shouldn't be telling people. He puts that together, Ayn Rand's identifications in political philosophy, with coercive government agencies and totally collectivized societies like Nazi Germany. They're all trying to tell you what to do. Yeah, but one's trying to tell you what to do at the point of a gun, and the other is telling you what to do through the stroke of a pen addressed to your mind, with words directed to your thought, not a bullet directed to your brain. So he puts into one package by implication. I think his desired target is the compulsory, the coercive ordering of people around. But it becomes, because of the nature of his argument, it becomes no one can know when it comes to ethics and politics. No one can know. So this is what Ayn Rand calls the argument from ignorance. I think that's what she calls it. She damns conservatives with 3 arguments. And one of them is that nobody knows. It's the argument from the lack of knowledge, the inability to know. And that's why socialism fails. It's not that, well, socialism goes against the needs of the reasoning mind that keeps us alive, which is Ayn Rand's viewpoint. It's that socialism, nobody can be smart enough to know what orders to issue. Now, that doesn't play real well in an age of artificial intelligence, where it seems like huge streams of data fed into a computer can tell you what are the best arrangements. So we should send out the Gestapo and the NKVD or the KGB or whatever it's called now, it's got a new name, to make you do what the giant computer says is the best for everyone. So against that, the argument is, no, you can never build a computer big enough. You can never have enough data. And if you think otherwise, you're conceited. Reason doesn't go that far. Now, here's Ayn Rand's argument against force and planning. Even if you know what's good for another person, and you know it and can prove it, even if you had an instrument to get inside his brain and see all of his values and his knowledge and his lack of knowledge, so you were like God, omniscient about what is in that person's self-interest, you cannot force him to do that. The attempt to do it will destroy the value that it could have if he recognized it through his own mind. The issue for objectivism is that values are objective, not intrinsic, and not subjective. That is, that values are values to somebody reached by that person's mind. It's his understanding. It's not enough that you know what's good for him. If he doesn't know it, if you want to help him, educate him. But to force him to act against his conclusions is to paralyze his means of survival, his mind. And what you're dealing with then is forced obedience, not valuing. Valuing means that you choose to understand the beneficial relationship something that you could get would have to your life. If you don't see that, a gun aimed at your head is not going to then explain it. A threat is not an explanation. It does not turn on the mind to grasp the value significance of what the threat is ordering you to do. Now, of course, the use of force breaks down to two categories, and I'm only talking about one because that's what Hayek is talking about. Force can be used to hurt you deliberately. Yeah, I know that I'm beating this guy up and I'm not doing it for his good. I'm doing it because I hate him or I want to take his wallet or whatever it is. But that's not how socialism is, and all forms of collectivism are presented. It's not presented as, hey, we've got the guns, let's loot. It's presented as, we are telling you you have to take the vaccine or you cannot take the vaccine because we know better and you are wrong in your conclusion. We're going to force you to obey our conclusion. Let me hasten to add that it is not force if a private individual who is hiring you or is inviting you into his home or otherwise exercising his individual rights says, I won't do it if you're not vaccinated. Or conceivably, if you are vaccinated, I won't hire you. So force is government. Government is force Force comes in two kinds: governmental and criminal. Properly, as Ayn Rand identified, in the kind of statement that Hayek would object to as unprovable, the government's use of force should only be in retaliation. That's properly. The government's force should be used only in retaliation against the criminals and foreign invaders who would use it, who would initiate its use or do initiate its use to deprive you of a value and harm you. But whether it does that, I mean, that doesn't describe any government in the current world. It almost fit, 98% fit the original American government that used its force in protection of individual rights against force wielded by criminals and foreign invaders. But there's no place now no government that does only what it should do. They do some of what they should do. They do use force to counter initiated force, to retaliate. But most of what they do, like 10 times that amount of force by the government, is initiated to make you do what they want you to do or think you ought to do. And it's justified by, we're doing this for your own good. Right? For instance, well, am I straying too far? Yeah, I won't give you the for instance, but I had in mind the FDA, Food and Drug Administration in America, which is premised entirely on using force against you for your own good, as they see it. So Ayn Rand's argument against socialist use of force for the good of everybody is that you cannot achieve the good at the point of a gun, because the good is a relation of the individual's mind to the facts of reality. It's someone's grasp of the fact that a particular future state of affairs would be beneficial to him, and his pursuit of that, trying to bring it about because of that. But Hayek doesn't believe that. So he has an argument, not force is destructive and you can't achieve the good by force, to, well, who knows enough to use force in the right way? Meaning initiated force. There's no dictator that's smart enough to be a benevolent dictator. They always get it wrong. Well, yeah, they do. But the basic answer, so much more fundamental, is even if you knew that something was wrong or right for the individual, like he shouldn't marry this woman, he should marry that other woman, the moment you bring orders and force and dictation into it, you destroy him. You nullify his mind, and his mind is his most precious survival instrument. Now, where does that come from? Where does Hayek get the idea that we can't talk about right and wrong, we can only talk about evolved traditions that have worked so far? He holds certain philosophic premises which just about everybody except Ayn Rand holds. And I wrote down, for a comparison of Ayn Rand against Hayek, a number of them, but the kind of presenting syndrome, I was going to say the fundamental, but it can be explained. The presenting symptom is taking emotions as primaries. Hayek thinks that human beings are driven by emotions, not by reason. Okay, maybe not all the time, and maybe not everybody all the time, but basically, man is a brute. So he thinks that because he believes in innate drives. I should document some of this. Now, Hayek writes in a terrible style. So you'll have to bear with his language here. Neither is it important, so-and-so isn't important, and neither is this, is not important for our present purposes, how much of the abstract structure that we call mind, the abstract structure we call mind? Your mind is yourself, says Galt in his speech in Atlas Shrugged. The abstract structure that we call mind is, so it's not important for our present purposes how much of the abstract structure that we call mind is transmitted genetically and embodied in the physical structure of our central nervous system, or how far it serves only as a receptacle enabling us to absorb cultural tradition. The results of genetic and cultural transmission may both be called traditions. So this is his view of man. Well, some of what you do is determined by biologically implanted urges and drives. And to that extent, you're an animal. But to some extent, what you do is caused by the culture, by the fact that you are an abject little conformist, and you do what your culture tells you to do, and that's been selected for work, for success. So some of your drives have been biologically implanted, and some of your behavior comes from believing unquestioningly what mommy told you. And we don't have to say, what the percentage is. Is it 30, 70, 60, 40, 50? That doesn't matter. What matters is that what's ruled out is you, your mind, your intellect, your ability to say, mommy told me so-and-so, but she was wrong. And as to the emotions and drives, what Hayek doesn't grasp is what Ayn Rand says about, and she's not the only one, Aristotle before her, that your emotions come from the content of your ideas. Emotions reflect learned conclusions. And the evidence for this is so abundant. For instance, if you pick up the newspaper and read, price controls have been imposed on all major industries. If you hold certain beliefs and ideas, you're going to applaud that. If you hold others, you're going to have the feeling of despair. I hope you're in the latter camp. But in either case, if you hold up that newspaper before a newborn infant, or a 2-year-old, or a 5-year-old even, there will be disinterest. There will be neither joy nor despair, because he doesn't know what the phenomenon is and how it relates to him and his values. I mean, this is just so obvious. All of us know it directly, that what we feel comes from how we appraise the situation, for me or against me. So feelings are not primaries. They are products of the beliefs and values that you have formed. Beliefs and values that might be right or might be wrong. But you are not driven by unaccountable biologically implanted drives. Nor are cultural traditions binding upon you if you choose to think. I'm going to brag a little. My mother was an altruist, and she used to say to me all the time things like, you weren't put on this earth just to serve yourself. and you, that's all you think about, you. And so many variants on that. And I didn't agree with it from the word go. And the word go came in when I was 4 or something. So it is entirely possible to disagree with your parents' assertions. Well, what if they bop you on the head if you disagree? Well, then it's entirely possible you learn to keep your mouth shut, but that has no effect on your mind except for you to judge your parents as bad. So the idea of determinism, that everything you are and do is causally necessitated by something earlier in your history and then earlier in the history of the universe, is false. Whether you say, oh, you're determined by genes or you're determined by your social environment, you aren't. You have a mind. And in fact, your nod of assent, yes, I am a product of my, is itself a reflection of your ability to make up your own mind. Are you saying that, oh, yes, I nod because I was given cookies for nodding when I was younger, or because my hormones are flowing in the nodding direction? Or are you nodding because that fits in with what you have come to believe? And that you can think about it, you can question it, you can judge it, you can change it. You damn well better. Okay. I said I was going to say that I was tempted to say that the root error is taking emotions to be primaries. But the real fundamental is a view of concepts. A view that concepts, ideas are not formable from perception. So practically everyone in the era after Hume and Kant believe that there's no such thing as right and wrong concepts, valid and invalid concepts. Ayn Rand disagrees. Concepts are based upon perception, but they involve and require a process she called measurement omission to abstract from the degree to which a certain characteristic is present. I won't go into that. It's an introduction to objectivist epistemology. But if you hold that concepts are not a valid grasp of reality, and by a concept, I mean a general idea, even as general, narrow as book or finger or apple, but certainly wider ideas like fruit, body part, and communication, and above all, the highest, most abstract concepts such as existence, identity, awareness, causality, and value. So if you believe that concepts are cut off from perceptual reality in the first step, you'll never get to the idea of a process of widening abstractions from a valid concept. And people don't have that idea. If you don't have the idea of a hierarchy of concepts, you can't bring reason into ethics. Because Ayn Rand's solution to the is-ought dichotomy, and it's the only way to solve it, is by showing that the concept of value hierarchically depends upon the concept of life. And the concept of life hierarchically depends upon the alternative of to be or not to be, existence or non-existence. So there are life-based values that keep you in existence, and there are values leading to death. And this is the fundamental alternative behind all values. So I won't go into that in any detail in this broadcast. But you see what I'm going for? If you don't understand that some ideas, some concepts require and rest upon others, you can't show what the concept of value and good depends upon, and you can't trace it back to perceptual reality. So until the so-called problem of universals was solved, we couldn't have a rational ethics or a rational anything. Philosophers make a big deal out of you can't derive normative statements from non-normative premises because their idea of derive is deduce from earlier knowledge. They don't even grant the possibility of abstracting from perception. And it's true you can't deduce normative conclusions, value judgments from purely factual premises. But that's also true of meteorological statements or geometric statements or arithmetical statements or statements about carpentry. I want to see someone deduce statements about carpentry from premises that have nothing to do with carpentry. It can't be done. And that's not the way we have concepts of things like carpentry or any other field. We have them by building them up from perception. But there was a problem of explaining how that was done. Now that's what Ayn Rand solves in her book, Introduction to Objectivist Epistemology. And until you solve that problem, you're really handicapped. And I don't know how anyone would do any better than Hayek did. But if they were honest, they would admit that they wouldn't attempt to salvage a defense of freedom out of nobody's smart enough to tell me what to do. But if they were, I'd have to do it. I want to read you some of Ayn Rand's marginalia comments to end my part of this before I take questions. Oh, I should begin with this. In a letter to Rose Wilder Lane, Ayn Rand wrote in 1946, "Now to your second question. Do those almost with us do more harm than 100% enemies? Do those who are almost with us do more harm than 100% enemies?" I don't think that this can be answered with a flat yes or no, because the almost is such a wide term and can cover so many different attitudes. I think each particular case has to be judged on its own performance, but there is one general rule to observe. Those who are with us but merely do not go far enough, yet do not serve the opposite cause in any way, are the ones who do us some good and who are worth educating. Those who agree with us in some respects, yet preach contradictory ideas at the same time, are definitely more harmful than 100% enemies. As an example of the kind of almost I would tolerate, I'd name Ludwig von Mises. As an example of our most pernicious enemy, I would name Hayek. That one is real poison. Her comments on the road to serfdom abound with things like the goddamn fool. Who decides all that? By what standard? The fool is so saturated with all the bromides of collectivism that it is terrifying. She has some penetrating criticism, but I'm going for the inflammatory stuff. Here's what she wrote at the end of chapter 11 of The Road to Serfdom. Good God, what a mixture of ideas. The mind, then, is a collective attribute, in Hayek's view, or collective process, according to the damn fool. The, quote, growth of reason, quote, does not depend on any collective, in her view. The progress of human knowledge is a sum of individual work of many individual minds, each step in it strictly an individual act. If collectivists wish to have everything, quote, continuously planned by reason, the mistake close quote, the mistake lies only in forgetting that reason is an attribute of the individual. And if his life is planned by another or number of men, it is not planned by reason, not by his reason, which is the only thing that can plan for him. Parenthesis, besides, you cannot, quote, plan by reason, quote, if you start with the premise that man exists for others. On what reason is that based? So I can break down other philosophical differences between them, but I think I've spoken long enough that I have to take some questions. We're actually at 4:02. Without Hayek, there would have been no Thatcher revolution in England. Wrong. The things like the Thatcher revolution come about because of morality. There's a moral shift. People get mad and they won't take it anymore because the other side is overshot, if it's this case. And people are fed up with it because they have enough self-esteem and enough attachment to the right morality that they've had it. They've had enough. Curious as to why you have so much more respect for her than Reagan. I do have a lot more respect for her. First of all, she was forceful. She was absolute, right? She was the steel lady. No one ever called Reagan the steel man. Reagan was, there you go again. Gosh and golly, I just don't know, what's wrong with you? And so on a sense of life level, Thatcher cut a better figure than Reagan the weak. Secondly, Thatcher did some things. Reagan was 90% bluster and 10% action. For instance, get the government off your back was his campaign rhetoric. What did he do? He expanded government spending significantly. Government was bigger at the end of his years in office than it was bigger right away than when he entered. His dealings with Russia were weak. He did one thing, and Ayn Rand praised him for this. He called it an evil empire. See, in the objectivist view, morality carries the day. And when he called them evil, that did more than all the so-called arms build-ups and everything else that was done. The moral sanction is what determines the fate of these countries. When they lose their moral sanction, people don't follow them anymore. I could go on at some length. Was Milton Friedman even worse than Hayek? No. His positions were about the same. Hayek is no advocate of laissez-faire, and I have a quote here where he specifically disavows laissez-faire. It's in this one. It says, we're not talking about laissez-faire. And in the Constitution of Liberty, he hems in the free market to a significant extent. Sure, he's to the right of most politicians, but he's not an advocate of laissez-faire, and Friedman isn't either, but he's a lot closer. Friedman can communicate with people, he's deceased now. Free to choose that series. Hayek could never have done a series like that. He couldn't write a straight sentence. Let me read you his first sentence. This book argues that our civilization depends And what's he going to say? On freedom? On reason? Is it going to be a clear sentence? Here's the sentence. This book argues that our civilization depends not only for its origin, but also for its preservation on what can be precisely described only as, I'm already asleep, the extended order of human cooperation. Wow! I'm for the extended order of human cooperation too. An order more, I'm still going to the first sentence, an order more commonly, if somewhat misleadingly, known as capitalism. To understand our civilization, one must appreciate that the extended order resulted not from human design or intention, but spontaneously. It arose from unintentionally conforming to certain traditional and largely moral practices, many of which men tend to dislike, whose significance they usually fail to understand, whose validity they cannot prove, and which have nonetheless fairly rapidly spread by means of an evolutionary selection, the comparative increase of population and wealth, of those groups that happen to follow them. Now, Milton Friedman would never write anything as bad as that. And I'm talking about bad communicatively, not in content. It's horrendous in content, but if it were clear, he would stand a chance of gaining my respect in that regard, but he can't. Now let's see what else was asked.
Yeah. So we have a statement that's Adam has asked you to comment on. He says, Wikipedia co-founder Jimmy Wales considers himself an objectivist, but the operational model of Wikipedia seems to be, as near as I can make out, based on Hayek's epistemology, and yet the Wikipedia's existential utility is evident. Please comment.
Yeah, well, it's not based on Hayek's model. Look at what Hayek's model is. Practices which men tend to dislike, whose significance they usually fail to understand, whose validity they cannot prove. Well, Wikipedia demands that you cite your evidence. Whose validity they cannot prove, and which have nonetheless fairly rapidly spread by means of an evolutionary selection, the comparative increase of population and wealth of those groups that happen to follow them. There's none of that applied, and the conforming to certain traditional and largely moral practice. There's no conformity in Wikipedia. There's cooperation. So he talks about the extended order of human cooperation, and there is no such thing as the extended order of human cooperation. There's only cooperation. People have cooperated, I am one of them, in editing articles for Wikipedia. But they are vetted when they do it. I mean, I've made edits which are then taken out because they're looked at as too self-serving. They demand references. It is surprising, you know, I admit that I would never have thought that Wikipedia would turn out as well as it has. I would have thought, you know, it has to be curated better than by those who care enough to get in there and edit it. But it has. So you could say that it's a spontaneously arising, but it isn't. Each person who writes there writes by conscious thought, not just, oh, well, I'm giving voice to what's in the air. And they're vetted to make sure they have specific attribution and evidence. And if they don't, they're taken off. Now, that doesn't happen in the Hayekian world. So no, it is not Hayekian. It's like a superficial similarity, but look, someone said, if you want to arrange a bag of potatoes so that they are most compact, all you need to do is shake the bag And that's really true. You don't go in there and take each potato and measure it and put it in. But if you could, it would be even better than shaking the bag. And shaking the bag has nothing to do with the appeal to tradition. Tradition sucks. Tradition, slavery. Slavery was the rule for human beings up until the 19th century. Every country, the Pope, the Vatican had slaves until into the 19th century. So tradition is vile. Well, I'm getting overexcited. If an idea is true, it's because it's based on reality, not because other people have mouthed it for centuries. Is there another question?
Yeah. Michael asks, did Aristotle give existence identity while Ayn Rand gave consciousness identity?
Well, that's what I have said as a kind of simplification and not 100% historically accurate. Parmenides was the philosopher who came out with, it is. What is, what is not, and cannot be thought. Aristotle, in his solution to the problem of change, put forward the previously unthinkable idea that all change is of something specific to something specific in something specific by means of a specific potentiality arising out of the nature of that thing. So before that, if you read your Bible, the wooden stick becomes a snake. The burning bush is not consumed. It burns, but it does not burn up, which is a contradiction. So people did not grasp how the law of identity applied before Aristotle. Certainly not to any significant extent, how the law of identity applies to actions. See, Aristotle discovered, if you want to get into this, Aristotle discovered the entity accident, sorry, I didn't mean to say accident, the entity attribute distinction. Even Plato made a halting step in that direction, but people did not grasp the difference. This is really hard to believe, but it's not just objectivist philosophers who say this. People did not understand the difference between poverty and the poor. The Greek language did not make a distinction. You could say the poor, meaning those people who are poor, or the condition of being poor, which we have a separate word for poverty, that would be called the poor. So they could not distinguish between a characteristic of a thing and the thing as an entity. Aristotle created that distinction. Is there another?
Again from Michael, why are intellectuals so afraid of freedom? Why do they dedicate their careers to destroying it?
Because freedom is selfish, and they're good altruists. What I don't get is the intellectuals haven't had a great struggle to overthrow the Christian theology. But they don't dare overthrow the Christian morality. It's Christianity that introduced the idea of sacrifice, surrender your value, render unto Caesar what is Caesar's, and render unto God what is God's. There's nothing left for you. What about keep what's yours? And that's the mildest form of it. It's more blessed to give than to receive. Love thy neighbor as thyself. Well, what if thy neighbor is a disgusting jerk? And not, you can't love all men, but thy neighbor really means any other person. So is Christianity, that there's nothing like that in Greece, in ancient Greece. Christianity introduced the idea of the worship of weakness, the worship of need, the subordination of ability to need. When Marx says, from each according to his ability, to each according to his need, he's just quoting the Bible. I mean, he's not literally quoting the spirit of the Bible, the ethics of the Bible. So why do they have so much trouble rejecting the Christian morality when it hasn't been that hard to reject the belief in God and the whole religious system before more fundamental than morality? I don't have an answer to that.
Okay. Again, from Michael. Why are you not overly pessimistic about the future of Western civilization?
Because however pessimistic I am, I don't view that as overly. I think he means why am I not very pessimistic for the future of Western civilization? I'm more pessimistic than I was, but basically the truth will win. Because as long as there are people like me pointing it out, and I include all the, the intellectuals following Ayn Rand, there's no answer to it. And eventually, more and more young people are going, before they're completely brainwashed or destroyed, are going to resonate to that, and it's going to make a difference. But it's going to take longer than I thought. I thought when I read Atlas Shrugged, I literally thought the country would turn capitalist within 4 or 5 years. That was in 1962 that I read Atlas Shrugged. And to me, that ended everything. The game was up. Especially given that Atlas Shrugged was selling, huge numbers of copies, so it wasn't sitting unread somewhere on the shelf. But people's ability to compartmentalize is phenomenal. So the number of people who will say, Ayn Rand changed my life, is about 100 times bigger than the number of people who will actually change their lives to live rationally, fully. So the ability to say, yeah, this is great, I agree with it. Now, maybe I can get the government to grant me a subsidy and starve my competitor, or things, more settled than that. I still go to church. Why not go to church? Or any of a number of other contradictions of what they read in Atlas Shrugged. And then you don't know what they got out of Atlas Shrugged either. So why am I not totally pessimistic? Because reality is on our side, and eventually more and more people will see it. Unfortunately, it's a slow, long, and more people are seeing it now. I mean, look what we're doing here. We're on a UK, what would you call it? Enterprise site activity. Let me tell you what the UK was like in the 80s in regard to objectivism. I visited several times in the 80s, and every time I did, I would go to a bookstore and ask, what did they have by Ayn Rand? They had not even heard the name. I'm including in that Heffer's bookstore in Cambridge. The university bookstore, Heffer's, the huge store. I asked salespeople, what do you have by Ayn Rand? Who? The woman who wrote Atlas Shrugged. You've heard of Atlas Shrugged? No. The Fountainhead? No. But I'll take you to our computer and we can look it up. And they found one obscure commentary on objectivism by Mimi Gladstein, very obscure, not good commentary. and they recognized We the Living. That was in their catalog. They didn't have it, but they told me they could order it. Now, this was after Ayn Rand's death, so she had written everything, that we now have at our disposal. So consider that as a change. How about India? India, with over 1 billion people, they show great respect for Ayn Rand. Whenever you see Ayn Rand mentioned, and it's frequent, because I get Google alerts on Ayn Rand, it's always with respect. It's always positive. So the foreign, and in Latin America, it's growing pretty well in Latin America. The foreigners who have not been lobotomized by John Dewey's progressive education are much more receptive to Ayn Rand's ideas than Americans whose spirit is much more in accordance with Ayn Rand's spirit, but have been raised through the progressive education system that she wrote about in scathing terms. And they're unable to connect ideas. So why am I not more pessimistic than I am? I'm an orchid. No, I think because the truth, you can't hide the truth forever. When Aristotle was rediscovered in the 1100s and 1200s, the Arabs had kept Aristotle, and they were way ahead of Europe because they had Aristotelian philosophy to some extent, not exclusively. Obviously, they didn't really live by it, but that was one of their traditions, and they brought it into Europe. And that's why Europe couldn't win the Crusades, because the Arab technology, they had steel, fine silks, and a huge trade network. They were way ahead of the Europeans who lacked it. But when Aristotle was rediscovered, after a century or so, he was the main philosopher, and we had the Renaissance. We began, the early stages of the Renaissance. The Renaissance is usually dated from 1492, that's the official beginning for certain reasons. And Aristotle entered really strongly with Thomas Aquinas in 1250-ish. So that's 240 years, but he did win because he was so much more sensible than the other philosophers.
From Mary Oline, why doesn't it scare more people that bureaucrats are in control of medicine?
It's the prestige of science has been granted to the State Science Institute, to use the reference from Atlas Shrugged. In Atlas Shrugged, there's the State Science Institute with the leading scientists of the time. So it's the prestige of science that has lent itself to things like the FDA. But there's a lot more antagonism to the CDC and the FDA now than there was pre-COVID. And that's a hopeful sign. I used to rail against the FDA. I call it the Federal Death Administration. I used to rail against it, before COVID, and no one would listen. Now they kind of, well, I get more of a hearing now for that. So why did they follow bureaucrats? There's a deeper answer than that. It's got the prestige of science. Anyone under, well, I shouldn't say, a large number of the people under the age of about 45 have been so mind destroyed by their education that they have no way to independently judge anything. And they're looking for someone to tell them what to do.
All right, one more from Michael. He asked, how do you explain psychopaths and free will? There is a lot of evidence that psychopathy is genetic.
Psychopathy. Yeah, that's how I explain it. I think many things of an extreme nature are physically caused. I don't know that. And there are people who try to say it's a result of bad philosophy that screwed up the person's mind. And there's something to that. Immanuel Kant, whom we regard as the worst, most evil philosopher in history, Immanuel Kant had a long correspondence with a young lady trying to get her to follow his philosophy and telling her what was right and what was wrong by his standards, vicious, evil standards, and what she was doing, and she committed suicide. Now, that's not a psychopath, but you could see that that could be a possible outcome of it too. But I think there has to be, don't you think there has to be a certain number, not insignificant number of people whose brains are messed up, just like there are people whose kidneys are messed up, or heart is messed up, or liver is messed up. There are, genetic abnormalities that appear with random reshuffling of chromosomes and some mutations. So you would expect there have to be some people physically messed up in their brains. Now, is that 1% of the psychopaths or 98%? I don't know. That's an empirical question. So Dylan has disappeared. So I think we are at the end of our time, and I'll thank you for coming and urge you to attend HBTV next week. Thank you and goodbye.